Grace held little Charles in her arms like she was holding the whole world, with love, fear, and exhaustion all tangled up in a single breath. The baby was struggling to breathe, his tiny face scrunched in pain, his tired little eyes trying their best to stay open. With her other hand, shaking, she typed on her phone, typed, deleted, typed again. It was late at night, and the dimly lit room smelled of milk, desperation, and a flicker of hope. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm a single mom and my baby needs emergency surgery. Please." She stared at the message like it wasn't enough. Like even though it came straight from her torn-up heart, the world might still ignore it. She hit send with her eyes shut, not even double-checking the number. It was this, or watched Charles slip away. What she didn't know was that she was about to change both their lives with a single tap. Across town, the lights of Blackwood Enterprises gleamed through glass windows, reflecting Boston's cloudy sky like the weather itself was carrying someone's pain. Inside, Ethan Blackwood, CEO, millionaire, cold-blooded strategist, was wrapping up yet another meeting about expanding his real estate empire. His life was built on sharp decisions, sky-high figures, and zero room for distractions. Until a buzz in his inner pocket caught him off guard. He pulled out his phone, almost out of habit. Unknown number, it said. He read the first line, then the second, and something inside him stopped. It wasn't just a plea for help. It was a silent, raw scream, cutting through every layer of his corporate armor. He didn't know why, but he just stood there, staring at those words like ghosts whispering in his ear. Back in Grace's tiny apartment, the old fin spun slowly, pushing around the heavy, hot air. She kissed her son's forehead. He was breathing like a wounded bird. Her heart was racing, with fear, guilt, and a thread of faith. Peeling walls, bills stacked on top of the fridge. The city sleeping outside her window. It all felt like it was closing in, but she refused to break. Ethan, still in his sleek glass office, slowly sat down, the phone locked between his fingers. That woman's words echoed in his head. "He's going to die if I can't get help." Blunt, dry, heart-wrenching. Most messages he got were people chasing money, clout, or favors. But this one had a soul, and something buried deep inside him began to stir. Grace closed her eyes for a moment. "Mommy's gonna fix this, baby," she whispered. It wasn't the first time she'd said it, but it might be the last, unless a miracle showed up. And at that very moment, across the city, a stranger was reading her message with a tight chest and a haunted look. She had no idea she'd reached the one man who could change everything, even if she didn't know who he was, not yet. The sound of rain grew louder, as if Boston itself was washing away the pain spilling out behind closed doors. In the middle of that noisy silence, between two worlds divided by millions of dollars and a forgotten past, an invisible thread had just started to form, and it all began with a message sent to the wrong number. The diagnosis hit like a cruel sentence: severe congenital heart disease. Little Charles had been born with a structural defect in his heart, a flaw that had been threatening his life. Since his very first cry, Grace sat frozen in the doctor's office, her eyes locked on the blank white wall. Everything else, the doctor's voice, the beeping machines, the sounds of the world, faded into a distant hum. The doctor was talking about surgery, urgency, risks. But all Grace could think was, "He's going to die if I can't get help." That one thought echoed in her mind day and night. There was no health insurance, no father, no one. Just her, and this tiny, helpless baby fighting a battle against time. The public hospital had filed a request to transfer him to a specialized facility, but the waiting list was long, and time was running out. Charles couldn't wait, but a surgery like that, it cost more than she'd earned in 5 years working part-time as a waitress. Nights were the worst. The cramped room got too dark, and the street light outside did nothing but throw shadows over her fears. Grace would watch her son sleep and wonder how many nights they had left. Every time he coughed, she froze. Every time his breathing hitched, the floor seemed to vanish beneath her. It was a constant vigil, body and soul, a one-woman army facing an invisible enemy. The formula ran out faster than it should have. The diapers never made it to the end of the month. Bus fare tangled with the electric bill, and something always had to give. She sold whatever she could, clothes, books, even an old hairdryer. But it was never enough. It was never enough. The cost of the surgery loomed like a giant. She couldn't even bring herself to look in the eye, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a dark thought started to take shape. What if I can't do it? What if he dies in my arms? Each time that thought crept in, it hit her like a punch in the gut, a tightness in her chest, a wave of nausea, a guilt that gnawed at her from the inside out. She blamed herself for everything, for being too young, for trusting the wrong promises, for bringing a child into a world she could barely survive in herself. Grace tried to stay strong, but exhaustion was a ghost that never left her side. She woke up tired, cried in the shower so Charles wouldn't see. Fear had moved in permanently, sitting right next to her on the couch. If I disappeared, no one would even notice. Thoughts like that slipped in, and she shoved them away with everything she had. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not while Charles was still fighting to breathe. The loneliness was deafening. No mom, no dad, no close friends. The neighbor next door helped when she could, sometimes with a bowl of soup, sometimes with a kind word. But it wasn't enough. It never felt like enough. It was like the world had slammed every door in her face. Hope was just a crack in the wall where a sliver of light managed to sneak through. And still, she clung to that sliver like her life depended on it. That night, after sending the wrong message, Grace didn't move. She knew the odds were slim. She knew chances were. No one would even reply. But still there was something. A thin, invisible thread of hope. A quiet voice deep inside, whispering that maybe, just maybe, life still had one last card to play. And that thought alone was enough to keep her from falling apart completely. Grace Walker was never the kind of girl who complained out loud. She had learned early on that the world didn't listen when poor girls screamed, born to an absent mother and a father she never knew. Grace grew up bouncing from one foster home to another, switching schools, facing suspicious glances. It was in that loneliness she learned how to survive. She washed, she cooked, she studied the best she could. Always afraid of being thrown away. Again, as a teenager, she lived through a summer that felt like something out of a movie. She went to visit a distant aunt in a small town, and that's where she met Ethan. He wasn't like the boys she knew. He was kind, curious. He laughed at her lame jokes. They were just 17. For a few weeks, they lived like the world wasn't cruel, like time didn't exist. But then the summer ended, promises faded, and Ethan never answered her messages again. Just another person who walked away. So Grace learned not to wait for anyone to come back. When she found out she was pregnant, she was alone. Charles's father vanished the second she told him. Changed his number, blocked her everywhere. Said she was trying to trap him with a baby. At the time, Grace had just started a nursing tech course. She had to drop out. The money dried up, and her belly kept growing. The baby was born premature. His cry was faint, but his eyes were wide open, like he already knew life was going to be tough. Motherhood changed her, not just because she was up every hour of the night or because she learned to make baby food from market scraps, but because, for the first time, someone depended on her completely, and that gave her a kind of strength she didn't even know she had. It was raw, instinctive, fierce love. Charles became her reason for everything, especially the reason she refused to fall apart. But underneath all that strength was a bone-deep exhaustion. Grace hadn't slept properly since the day he was born. She carried dark circles under her eyes, a sore back, and a quiet sadness. No one saw it. No one asked. She smiled for Charles, did funny voices, made up little bedtime stories. But when he finally drifted off to sleep, her own eyes filled with tears, she thought about everything she missed. Everything she gave up, everything she might never have. The mirror showed a 24-year-old with more scars than she should have had. Untrimmed hair, donated clothes, swollen feet from walking too much. But it also showed eyes that burned with fire, determined, unyielding, because behind all that fragility was a soul that refused to quit. Grace might have lost almost everything, but not the courage to keep going. She wasn't just some poor girl with a baby in her arms. She was a woman shaped by loss, carved by rejection, and driven by a love that defied logic. She didn't have luxury, or support, or guarantees. But she had faith, even if it wavered, even if the ground vanished beneath her feet. She clung to what was left, the instinct to protect, at any cost. And in that moment, standing by Charles's crib, after sending a message to a complete stranger, she had no idea that life was about to circle back to that forgotten summer, and to the one man who, without knowing it, still carried a piece of her. The alarm on Grace's phone went off every morning at 5:40, even on the nights she'd only gotten 2 or 3 hours of sleep. She had to get up, change her baby, make his bottle, and walk 40 minutes to the bus stop. Some days she took 2, sometimes even 3 buses just to get to the restaurant where she picked up shifts as a waitress. The pay wasn't much, but it helped cover part of the overdue rent. Charles came along in the stroller, wrapped in blankets and hope. Finding someone to watch him during her shifts wasn't always possible. Sometimes she left him sleeping in the back of the kitchen, with the silent approval of the manager, who was also a single mom. The clatter of dishes blended with Charles's muffled cries, and the guilt that never left. It sat heavy in her chest, like carrying a brick around all day. She served fake smiles to customers while her heart quietly shattered. One afternoon, she came home to find the power cut, the fridge was off, the formula spoiled, and the heat unbearable. She sat on the floor, holding her feverish, sweaty baby, and cried softly. Then she ran to the nearest urgent care center, but there was no pediatrician. Come back tomorrow. Mom, tomorrow. Tomorrow might be too late. But no one else seemed to get that. No one but her. There was also the sting of not being able to afford medicine. She knew the pharmacy inside out, the cheapest generics, the most affordable antibiotics. Once, the pharmacist offered to write down the debt. It was humiliating, but she accepted. For her son's life, she'd accept anything. She even sold her grandmother's ring, the one she promised to keep forever, but forever felt like a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. Friends had started to drift away over time. Some said she had closed herself off, others just disappeared. The few who stayed had their own problems. A 10-minute phone call here and there, a quick message with a heart emoji, but nothing that really helped. When the pain fully settled in, all that remained were the walls, the silence, and the fear. The fear was the worst part. Not the sharp kind that hits you with bad news, but the slow, creeping kind, the kind that leaks into the cracks of your day. Fear of not waking up on time, fear of coming home to find Charles burning with a fever, fear of not making it, fear of being forgotten. She carried that fear in her spine. It was what kept her going, and what broke her a little more every day. Some days, Grace almost forgot what it felt like to smile for real. Life was so urgent, so practical, that there was no room left for lightness. But then Charles would look at her with those wide eyes, flash one of his toothless grins, and something inside her would flicker back to life. Brief, like the spark of a match, but real. And she clung to that spark like it was the only thing still holding her up. It was on one of those gray, heavy days, walking home from the pharmacy with coins in her pocket and diapers in her hands, that she saw the notification on her phone. Message seen? She froze. Who was that number? Could it be someone? might actually answer. The hunger, the heat, the unpaid bills, all of it faded for just a moment. And hope, even the smallest sliver of it, stepped forward. That morning, after another sleepless night and a terrifying moment when Charles's breathing faltered, Grace made a decision. She was going to ask strangers for help. She went to a small internet cafe downtown, paid 3 reais for 30 minutes, and started searching for donation groups, NGOs, influencers, anyone who might share her crowdfunding page. She felt exposed, almost ashamed. But shame didn't save lives. She had to swallow her pride. Her hands shook as she recorded the video. "Hi, my name is Grace. I'm a single mom. And my baby, Charles, has a serious heart condition." Her voice broke. Her eyes were soaked. She showed the medical report, the tiny room. Her son, she asked, she pleaded, and when she finally hit publish, her stomach turned inside out. Then came the waiting. Hours spent refreshing the page, hoping for a miracle that never came. Most of the views were just curiosity. Some left cruel comments. Another one trying to make money online. Others demanded proof, questioned her story, called her irresponsible. It hurt more than she expected. She deleted the comments, tried to ignore them, but something inside her cracked a little more with every notification that brought no help. It felt like screaming into a bottomless pit. Like the world could hear her, but didn't care enough to answer. She walked home with her shoulders slumped, Charles's stroller bouncing over cracks in the sidewalk. He slept peacefully, unaware that his mother had almost fallen apart. Again, on the way, she saw a church with its doors open. She walked in, sat in the last pew, didn't say a word, just closed her eyes. She hadn't prayed in years. But that day, she thought, if anyone's listening, please hear me. Hours later, at home, as she was putting Charles to bed, her phone buzzed. It was the unknown number. Her heart jumped. Her hands trembled as she opened the message. "Hi, I received your message. Can you tell me more about your son's condition?" She read it over and over. It was polite, direct, but what really caught her attention was the profile photo. A man in a suit, standing at some corporate event. Completely outside her world. Hesitantly, Grace replied. She explained the diagnosis, the surgery cost, the hospital wait list. She didn't try to guilt-trip him. She just wanted him to know this wasn't a scam, it was desperation. The conversation was brief. He asked for her address and said someone would be in touch. She didn't know what to think. Is this real? Or just another illusion that's gonna break me all over again? The next morning, there was a knock at her door. A woman stood there, a social worker, wearing a gold badge and a gentle smile. She told Grace that Mr. Ethan Blackwood had covered Charles's admission to one of the best private hospitals in the city, pediatric wing, specialized staff. Grace was speechless. She held her son tight and kept asking, "Is this real? Is this actually happening?" And the woman just smiled, eyes glistening, like she knew she was witnessing something rare. On the ride to the hospital, in a quiet, fully equipped ambulance, Grace couldn't stop staring at her son. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a real chance, a real chance. But deep down, one question echoed. Why would that man help a complete stranger? Who was he, really? The answer was coming, sooner than she could imagine, and it would change everything. The hospital room where Charles was admitted didn't feel real. There were fresh flowers on the bedside table, toys tucked into a corner, and a soft armchair beside the clear crib. A smiling nurse explained the treatment plan, the tests that would be done, and assured her that everything had been urgently approved by Ethan Blackwood. Grace could barely breathe. It felt like she'd been dropped into another universe. She thanked the staff 1,000 times, but her heart still carried doubt. Rich people didn't help strangers for no reason. As she watched Charles sleep under the monitor's glow, questions swirled in her head. Who was this man? What was driving him? Why her? Why now? And why that strange feeling, that pinch in her chest every time she heard his name? The next day, a bouquet arrived with a card. Whatever you need. I'm close by. Ethan B. She picked up the card and stared at the handwriting like it was some ancient riddle. Something about that signature tugged at a thread buried deep in her memory. A memory rusted over, covered in dust. Then, suddenly, a voice echoed in her mind. Young, laughing, from a long-ago summer. Grace pulled out her phone and typed his name into Google. All the articles said the same thing. CEO, visionary, real estate empire, occasional philanthropist. But then she found a photo of him at 17, competing in a sailing championship. Her heart stopped. It was him, the Ethan from that summer, in Cape May, the boy who promised to write, who kissed her forehead goodbye, the one who never came back. The realization hit her like a silent avalanche. She felt dizzy, confused. It was too much of a coincidence to be random. But now what? Should she confront him, say thank you and pretend she didn't recognize him? The truth was a thorn in her throat, and fear crept back in. What if he recognized? Her hand regretted helping. What if he looked at her and only saw a shadow from the past? Meanwhile, across town, Ethan stared at the photo of Grace holding the baby. There was something hauntingly familiar in her face, in the pain behind her strength, in the faint scar beneath her chin. He spent hours trying to place it, and when the memory of that summer finally surfaced, he froze. It was her, the girl on the beach, the one with the easy laugh, the one who vanished before he could come back. The shock held him in silence. He didn't know what to think. She'd never reached out, never showed up. Why now? Was it just coincidence, or something more? Ethan felt torn, between the urge to go see her and the fear of reopening wounds he thought had long since healed. But deep down, he felt something he couldn't name, a kind of debt, a gap in his life that maybe, just maybe, he could finally fill. On the third day of Charles's hospital stay, Ethan showed up. No warning, no words, he just stood there, quiet, at the door. Grace looked up, and for a second, the world stopped. They stared at each other like they were living an entire story in a single glance. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken memories. And for just a few seconds, they were teenagers again, but with new wrinkles, fresh wounds, and a child between them. When Ethan stepped into the room, Grace stood up slowly, like she was walking through a dream. He was taller now, more serious, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, with that sharp, calculating gaze of someone used to deciding the fate of companies with a single signature. But his eyes were still the same. That same shade of sad blue that used to light up over the silliest things. A lump rose in her throat before she could say a word. Grace, he asked, hesitantly, like her name had been tucked away in an old drawer of forgotten memories. She nodded, speechless. She wanted to say 1,000 things. Where were you? Why didn't you ever reply? But all that came out was, it's you. And just like that, the past came crashing down on them, like a high tide pulling in memories, pain, and all the what-ifs they never got to live. They sat in silence. Charles slept between them, wrapped in wires and steady beeping. For a moment, they weren't a CEO and a single mother. They were just two young people, scarred by a summer that ended too soon, and by choices that changed everything. I looked for you after that summer, Ethan said quietly, like an apology. I sent texts, letters, nothing came back. I tried to, Grace replied, her voice low. But my aunt passed away that month. I was taken back to the city. The same day, I left my phone behind. Nothing ever got delivered. The silence that followed felt heavier than either of them had expected. A love that never had a chance, a connection torn apart by life, or maybe fate. Grace took a deep breath and finally said what she'd held in for years. I thought you forgot about me. That I was just some summer fling. Ethan turned. His face, like her words, had slapped him. You were the one thing I wanted to hold on to from that summer, he said. They both felt the cruelty of time, to completely different lives, opposite paths, and yet, here they were, surrounded by machines and heartache, with a baby between them. What about his father? Ethan asked gently. Grace hesitated. He left the day I told him, said he didn't want to be tied down, told me to figure it out on my own. Ethan swallowed hard. There was anger in his eyes, but also something else. Guilt, sadness. She stood up, tears in her eyes. I never asked you for anything. I didn't even know it was you behind that number. I was just desperate, and even now, with everything going on, all I wanted was to save my son. Her honesty cut through the air like a blade. There was no pride left, just the raw, painful truth of a woman who'd learned to fight with nothing but grit and bone. Ethan moved closer to Charles and gently touched his tiny hand. The baby stirred, barely. He's so small. And so strong. Ethan whispered. Grace nodded. He's everything. Their eyes met again. And in that moment, there was a quiet recognition of everything unspoken, everything lost. And maybe, just maybe, everything's still possible. But before any step forward, before any reconciliation, there was a child fighting to live. That night, Ethan left the hospital without saying another word. But when he got into his car, his eyes were red. He hadn't cried in years. But now it all came rushing back like a wave. The memory, the guilt, the ache of what could have been, and what still could be, if they were brave enough. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan felt fear. Fear of losing something he didn't even know he still wanted, until now. The surgery was scheduled for 3 days later. The doctor explained the risks, the procedure, the uncertainties. Grace listened like she was carving every word into her heart. Charles was too small, too fragile. But now there was hope. A team of specialists, state-of-the-art equipment, and, most of all, someone who finally believed in her. For the first time, she wasn't alone. Ethan started visiting every day. He didn't say much, but he was always there. Sometimes he brought coffee. Other times, he just sat quietly, watching Charles sleep. He seemed uncomfortable with vulnerability, like he wasn't used to being exposed. But there was something real in his eyes, like he was slowly learning how to be human again. Grace never asked for anything. No explanations. No promises. She just let him be there, in his own time. One tense night, Charles suddenly took a turn for the worse. The monitor beeped, doctors rushed in, and Grace felt the world collapse around her. Ethan arrived 30 minutes later, still in his suit, his face pale. He found Grace kneeling in the hallway, crying silently. Without a word, he sat beside her and placed his hand over hers. And for the first time, they cried together. The surgery lasted 6 hours. Grace couldn't stop pacing. Ethan, no longer the composed businessman, looked completely undone. Neither of them spoke, but there was an invisible force holding them together. Love, fear, urgency. When the doctor finally came out and said, "He made it," it was a success. The air rushed back into their lungs like they'd been drowning. For days, in the days that followed, Grace cared for Charles in the recovery room with quiet strength and tenderness. She learned how to use the equipment, manage his oxygen, monitor every signal. Ethan watched her. In awe. "You're a nurse. Without a diploma," he said, smiling for the first time. "You learn when there's no other choice," she replied, smiling back with tears in her eyes. Each day, Charles grew stronger. The doctors mentioned he could be discharged within 2 weeks. Grace started dreaming of simple things again. Going back to school, finding a better place to live, maybe doing work she actually loved. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a sentence. It felt wide open. And Ethan was still there, more present, more grounded, more human. One afternoon, he showed up at the hospital with an envelope. Inside was a full scholarship acceptance letter to a local nursing program. "It's just the beginning, Grace," he said. "But I believe in you." She didn't know whether to smile or cry. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "I want to," he replied, "because you reminded me who I was." Before I forgot, his words were a hug. The wounds didn't disappear. The past still hurt, but something was different now, a strength born from pain and care. Grace no longer saw herself as life's victim, and Ethan no longer hid behind his fortune. They were rebuilding together, and Charles, that tiny warrior, was the thread between them, the reason, the consequence, and the beginning of a journey that was just getting started. It was in the 3rd week after the surgery when Dr. Lawson, the head cardiologist, asked Grace to come in for a talk. He said it wasn't about Charles, at least, not in the way she feared. But something curious had come up in his genetic chart. Grace froze inside. Fear of a new complication twisted in her chest. But the doctor gave her a gentle smile. "It's not bad, Grace. Just surprising." Then he handed her a printed sheet, the results from the blood and genetic compatibility tests. She read it slowly, not understanding at first. What was that line supposed to mean? Genetically compatible with registered patient from Blackwood Foundation database. Her eyes lifted, confused. The doctor cleared his throat. "Mr. Ethan Blackwood is listed as a compatible donor, but the level of compatibility suggests something else, something much closer." Her knees nearly gave out. "You're saying that," he nodded. "Ethan isn't just a donor. He's Charles's biological father." The world spun, the room blurred, like she was dreaming. But that's not possible. Charles was conceived through IVF. And then it hit her. The clinic, the sperm bank, the profile she'd picked at random. Young, athletic, light eyes, leadership qualities. She'd never known the real name behind the donor, just a file. Grace walked out of the office as if moving through thick clouds. She found Ethan in the hallway and looked at him like she was seeing a stranger, and yet, someone she'd always known. He noticed the look in her eyes. Did something happen? He asked, concerned. She took a deep breath. "Do you remember donating genetic material?" "Back in college," Ethan frowned. "Yeah, I needed the money. It was anonymous." "Why?" She didn't answer. She just handed him the test results. Silence settled between them, long and heavy. Then he looked down at the paper. Then at Charles, sleeping peacefully in the crib. And he whispered, barely audible, "He's my son." A wave of shock, wonder, and something deeper swept through him. Fate brought us back together. Even when everything seemed so far apart, Grace was crying, but not from sadness. It felt like the final piece of a puzzle had locked into place. We were meant to find each other again. Ethan, even without knowing, he embraced her for the first time, strong, steady, with no guilt, no hesitation. There was surprise, yes, but also peace. They weren't just a people with unfinished history anymore. They were a family. And somehow, they had been all along, without even knowing it. The revelation changed everything, not just because of biology, but because of connection. Ethan no longer needed to help. He was a father, and Grace, without ever meaning to, had brought into the world the one thread that would tie them together forever. Charles wasn't just the child of an unbreakable mother. He was something more, a quiet answer from the universe, or maybe, from God, a sign that love, even if it couldn't bloom in the past, now had a second chance. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. Charles was stable, sleeping peacefully, but inside her, everything was a storm. The revelation that Ethan was her son's biological father twisted and turned in her chest. What was she supposed to do with that? What could she expect from him now? Would it even be fair to involve him? And more than anything, was she ready to face the feelings that still lived inside her, even if buried? The next morning, she asked him to talk. They sat in the hospital's outdoor garden, where transplant kids did their therapy between flowers and gentle breezes. Before anything else, she began, "I need you to know. You don't owe me anything, Ethan. Charles has always been my reason to fight, and if you just want to walk away, I'll understand. Her voice trembled, but her eyes held steady. She meant every word. Ethan was silent for a moment, like he was digesting it all. Then he spoke, his eyes wet. Grace, I grew up in a house where everything was about control, where love was a weakness and success was the only thing that mattered. I don't know what it means to be a father. But, for the first time, I want to learn. And more than that, I want to be with you, not out of duty, but because I choose to. She looked away, blinking back tears. You disappeared that summer. For so long, I thought I was just a fling to you. He lowered his head, and I thought you had left me. I came back, Grace. I went back to that town 3 times. I looked for you. I never knew what happened. The pain in their eyes was the same, not guilt, but loss. But now, there was room for healing. I loved you that summer, and I've never really loved anyone since, Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan gave a sad smile. Me neither. I buried myself in work, in money, in decisions. But seeing you again, seeing him, brought me back to life. Reminded me who I was before I got lost. It was like two souls finding each other again, tired, scarred, but still capable of starting over. She took a deep breath. You don't have to promise me anything. Just be present. He doesn't need a hero. He needs a father who stays when things get hard. And me, I just need honesty, nothing more. Ethan took her hand. I'm here, for the first time in my life. I want something that can't be bought. I want you. I want him. I want this. And in that simple touch, a decision was made. A new story began. Sunlight filtered through the trees, lighting up Charles's face through the hospital window. He woke, smiled, and mouthed something soundless. It was a sign, a new beginning. Grace and Ethan walked into the room together, side by side. The nurse smiled and said, "He always wakes up smiling now." And Grace, holding back tears, replied, "Maybe it's because he knows we're together." It wasn't a confrontation. It was a reunion with what had been lost: trust, love, family. And in that moment, with Charles between them, fragile and strong all at once, the past finally found its place. And the future started right there, full of possibilities. Weeks had passed since Charles's surgery. He laughed more often now, babbled sweet sounds, and no longer needed the wires that once tethered him to hope. Grace watched him grow each day, and sometimes she caught herself smiling in the mirror, something she hadn't done in a long time. She was, now, a stronger woman, more at peace, more whole. Life hadn't gotten easier, but it had gotten lighter. Ethan kept his word. He showed up. He found an apartment for them in a safe neighborhood, with big windows and room for Charles to crawl. "This isn't charity," he said. "This is family." Grace accepted it, with an open heart, but grounded feet. She was still her own woman, still determined to build her own future, and she was doing just that. She went back to school, enrolled in nursing, and within weeks, she stood out. She knew more than the textbooks. She knew the touch, the waiting, the pain. She knew the kind of love that keeps someone alive even when everything seems lost. And every class was a step toward the life she deserved, the one Charles deserved to watch her build with her own hands. Ethan, in turn, began reshaping his real estate empire with a different vision. He donated hospital wings, launched support programs for single mothers, and distanced himself from partners who only cared about profit. "I learned more from a woman in worn-out flip-flops than from all the embas I ever earned," he said once in an interview. The world noticed the change, but he didn't care. The real transformation was inside him. The traumas didn't disappear, but they found their place. Grace now understood that surviving wasn't the end, it was the beginning. She looked back at the past with less pain and more clarity. She saw that everything she lost shaped who she was, and that true love doesn't hold you back, it makes you stronger. Charles began taking his first steps. Every tiny stumble brought applause, laughter, and tears. The home that was once silent and cautious was now filled with music, the smell of cake in the oven, and bedtime stories whispered in the dark. Grace read to him every night. Once upon a time, there was a woman who fought through everything. And on a calm night, sitting on the porch, Ethan held Grace's hand and asked, "Do you forgive me for not being there from the start?" She looked into his eyes, squeezed his hand gently, and said, "You showed up when we needed you most. That's what matters." And in that look, there was no more pain, only understanding. Grace's story wasn't a fairy tale. It was one of battle, of loss and reunion, of a love that survived time, silence, and fate. And there, in that new life that bloomed a little more every day, she finally understood everything she had lived through wasn't in vain. It was all leading her here, whole, and finally, happy. Time passed. Charles turned 3, surrounded by blue balloons, chocolate cake, and laughter that felt like it could heal anything. In the middle of the party, he ran over to Ethan, pointed at his hand, and asked, "Where's your ring, Daddy?" Everyone laughed, but Ethan froze for a second. He looked at Grace. She gave him that bright, full of life smile and just shrug, as if to say, "It's your move." The following week, he took her to Cape May, the town where it all began. They walked the same beach, now older, calmer. There, he knelt down with a simple ring full of meaning. "Will you marry me?" he asked, "for everything we were, for who we are, and for all that we still can be." She cried and said yes, but with one condition: "Promise you'll never stop walking beside me, even when the winds change." And he promised. But there was one last revelation, something no one knew. At the clinic where Grace had undergone IVF, there had been a hidden detail. The egg hadn't been hers biologically, either. For medical reasons, she had received a donated embryo. Charles was the bond between two strangers who once loved each other unknowingly, and who had been chosen, separated, reunited, and connected, not by blood, but by soul. Grace found out during a routine appointment, and instead of feeling less, she felt more. Fate didn't write our story, she thought. It just brought us together. The rest we created with choices, with love, and with courage. She chose to keep that truth between them for now, because biology meant little compared to the life they had built. They were a family, chosen by life itself. One quiet night, as Charles slept between them on the couch, Ethan whispered, "You changed my life. You showed me the worth of things money could never buy." Grace smiled, gently running her fingers through their son's hair. "And you reminded me that even the most broken stories can have happy endings, if we're brave enough to keep writing them." The camera of life pulls back slowly. A girl who grew up with nothing, a man shaped by absence, a little boy who defied death, a love stitched together by time, pain, and hope. And in the background, one truth echoes: we never really know which wrong number might end up being life's most beautiful right turn. What would you do in his place? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this one.